I were to ask most of my viewers what they're worried about the most these days, I expect I would get answers like the housing crisis, lack of affordable rentals, the problems with healthcare, rising inflation, the major excesses that went on during COVID and during the lockdown that didn't succeed in stopping the disease and the fraudulent response to it. They may respond about mass immigration and how that is flooding these Western countries with unskilled workers who are clogging up the system in large urban areas. They might refer to the drug crisis that is gripping our streets in small towns and large cities with large amounts of tent cities and Trudeau towns everywhere. In the US, you might mention the feces map of downtown San Francisco or the people nodding out on fentanyl across from the police headquarters in the Tenderloin district. You know, there are a lot of things to be worried about. Maybe it would be the southern US border that's open. But in Canada, the leading lights are more concerned about another threat. They're concerned about too much free speech. Okay, so let me get started today with a column by a man named Lawrence Martin. And this is in the Globe and Mail, which is a leading left liberal paper, mainstream sort of left-leaning globalist type paper. Lawrence Martin is based in Washington, D.C., and his well-known book was about Stephen Harper, and he named it Harperland, The Politics of Control. So this actually got the National Booksellers Nonfiction Award in 2010, and the Hill Times in Ottawa voted it the best political book of the year. Can you imagine that? He must have a lot of really organic support across the intelligentsia. So I'm going to go over Martin's recent column in the Globe and Mail, which was entitled Excessive Free Speech is a Breeding Ground for More Trumps. This was published earlier today on March 20th, 2024. So let's read through this. Martin writes, there was a bit of good news about the future of public discourse this week. The United States Supreme Court, even though stacked with right-wingers, sounded like it was ready to give the Biden administration the go-ahead to try to persuade social media platforms not to put out content promoting nonsense about the presidential election, conspiracy theories about the pandemic, and other assorted bilge and crackpottery. The states of Missouri and Louisiana accused the government of stifling their speech by pressuring platforms to downgrade or drop their posts. But the justices, including conservatives, Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett, didn't sound like they were buying it. Good. Hopefully the court's final decision will tell the complainants where to get off. It would be a victory for regulation of the internet. But no one should get too excited. The genie is already out of the bottle, and there is little likelihood of getting it back in. The greater likelihood is that extremes of free speech will continue to be tolerated, creating a pathway for more Donald Trumps. The extremes came following the arrival of the internet and social media platforms. They created a tsunami of free expression. Despite the grumblings we still hear about the lack of free speech, these platforms gave more of it to the masses than anything ever before. When other communications revolutions like the printing press, radio, and television came along, they were still largely controlled by the elites. But when the internet came along, regulatory bodies like Canada's CRTC backed off. It was open season for anything that anyone wanted to put out. No license needed, no identity verification. What a far cry from the days when the masses had no outlets, save things like man on the street interviews, or letters to the editor, or protest placards. We moved from one extreme to the other. The masses were finally weaponized, not with arms, but with a communications instrument that empowered them against establishment forces like they had never been empowered before. The change represented one of history's significant power shifts. With the multitudes given megaphones, what a wonderful democratic advance it was. But it came with a rather massive irony. Free speech became as much a slayer of democracy as an enabler. Unchecked, the internet dumped megatons of raw sewage on the public square. With filters that had been around for ages now removed came mountains of misinformation and disinformation, and propaganda, polarization, child pornography. and threats against leaders, and bigotry and conspiracy claptrap. Would the rise of the hard right and Mr. Trump have been possible if the internet had been given guardrails? Not a chance. The internet gave him, before his account was suspended in 2021, 88 million Twitter followers. With that came the freedom to circumvent traditional media and create an alternative universe, a smear sphere, wherein he could lie like he breathes and get away with it. This also led to compartmentalizing the media landscape into left-right silos, which helped bring on the extremes of polarization. The way to reverse the trend is with rigid regulation. But the free speech lobby in the United States is as fierce as the gun lobby. The historic triumph the internet gave free speech is all but forgotten. The amnesiacs scream censorship. Joe Biden is out to crush free speech in America. Mr. Trump ludicrously charged recently. A New York Times analysis this week spelled out how Mr. Biden was intent on regulating the big tech companies, but in the face of the opposition from the free speech lobby, he has pretty much given up. In Canada, the Trudeau government's regulation attempts are being met with intense opposition, deservedly so in some cases, because legislation such as Bill C-63 goes way overboard in calling for life sentences for speech crimes and needs to be redrafted. But the dangers of the deregulated information sphere is nowhere what it is south of the border, where Mr. Trump and company have turned free speech into warped speech and could take the country off the rails. Small victories like we saw from the Supreme Court this week are too little too late, not enough to rein in the demons that have been set loose. Now, I wanted to focus on this column for one reason in particular. Martin's column is sort of a normie NIMBY take. I'm sure it's not particularly leftist, and he even admits that Bill C-63 goes too far, but he's uttering this sort of regurgitated robotic narrative that you have to parlay in order to be a quote-unquote serious thinker in the establishment media in Canada or the United States. His essential point is those crazy Bible thumpers and gun clingers, they're so racist, they're so evil. Gosh, we sure had a good thing going with the internet and sharing new ideas, but I never thought people would actually share ideas that offend me or ideas that upset my tranquility. Why can't things just be normal like before the bad orange man came along? Why can't we just have diversity and feel good and stop allowing mean words on the internet? Mean words are going to cause World War III. I prefer to call people like Martin digital NIMBY normies. So they are basically people who can't stand the fact that they have never been in touch with reality, their version of the world order, of politics, of what is normal, of what constitutes harmful speech, of what constitutes normal speech, and a conspiracy and fact is just completely deranged, which is why they're given a platform by places like the Globe and Mail. Now, his entire point here is basically saying that free speech needs to have moderate controls and guardrails on the internet so people can't say things alleging certain opinions about the previous American election or about the political situation or about controversial medical decisions or any sort of things that are not respectable. And his use of these very colorful words like demons and smear sphere and all the echo silos and all this kind of thing. It's the words of someone who's just not in touch with reality and who thinks that he's being brave by calling out the exact enemy that everyone in his office and entire social circle loves to get together with on a Friday night and laugh about, those ignorant rednecks. These people are nothing but ignorant bullies, obviously, but they have a lot of institutional power and they bring a fake kind of gravitas to their whole thing of we have to stop democracy to save democracy argument. I want to also bring attention to a recent secret RCMP report entitled The Whole of Government 5-Year Trends for Canada, which actually warns the federal government that Canada may soon descend into civil unrest once citizens realize the hopelessness of their economic situation. A quote from this report notes that the coming period of recession will accelerate the decline in living standards that the younger generations have already witnessed compared to earlier generations. Clearly, this is nothing surprising with Canada among the lowest growth economies in the OECD, with raising minimum wage barely keeping pace with the massive runaway inflation, with a semi collapsing healthcare system and people dying in ER waiting rooms, with drug addicts nodding out and dying all over the streets, and doctors completely overstressed, expect to work double shifts every day, with nowhere to live that doesn't cost you your entire life savings or put you deeply into debt, and with a government that spent the past few years going after a bunch of truckers who didn't want an experimental medical procedure done on them. We definitely have some issues here. And the fact that Canada also has a massive productivity crisis in its economy and also has a super bad situation with the cost of construction materials doesn't help matters at all. Far apart from purely controversial social takes or political opinions, it's important that Canadians have the right to talk about what's really happening with the economy and how their money is being devalued and stolen out of their pockets. Now, I, for my part, am not a free speech absolutist, and I actually do agree with censorship. So I am not approaching this story from the typical point of view that most viewers probably expect, where I'm saying that we need to let people say anything they want. But there is some merit to the concept of the war of ideas and the best ideas will win out. But I understand the concerns of those on the right and left who feel that deception or misinformation or different tactics and strategies may be deployed at a mass scale to mislead people. I personally believe it could be much more related to pushing left wing social projects and experimental aspects like that. However, the issue for me is not that there is a lack of free speech, it's that the wrong people are in charge of curtailing free speech. Now, there will always be a limit on what you can say exactly, but the issue is what is that limit and who defines it? Even in supposedly free countries like the United States, it's clear that there is not full free speech and that your speech does lead eventually to legal consequences. However, the question is why exactly? What are the legal precedents? And moreover, who is in charge of making these laws and regulations? Who is in charge of enforcing them? And what are their motivations and end goals? In other words, do they want what you and your family want, or do they have something else in mind? And I think at this point, almost all of us can answer that with full confidence.